Welcome to Catalyze. I'm your host, Sarah O'Carroll. I have with me Laurel Wamsley, class of '06, and a reporter for NPR. I spoke with Laurel to hear about what it's been like to cover the coronavirus pandemic. Laurel, thanks for making some time to speak with me.
Of course, I'm glad to do it.
So are you still in the D.C. area, or where are you reporting from?
Yes, I'm talking to you from my home office here in the Columbia Heights neighborhood of Washington, D.C., where I live.
Well, I'm sure that the transition to remote work has been a lot to get used to, but then again, maybe not, because I know that as a journalist, you've likely reported from many non-traditional work environments. So I first wanted to ask how the coronavirus has changed your interview process.
Yeah, it definitely has changed things. I mean, I'm mostly a digital reporter. I do radio stories, but the bulk of what I do are written stories. So I've always been doing a lot of phone interviews. So in some ways that hasn't totally changed. What has changed is how I do them and sort of the tools I use. So normally if I was working on a story and I was working from the NPR headquarters, I would set up time to use one of our recording booths and I'd go in there and record. And since this started, obviously I'm working from home. I haven't been at the office since like March 11th or 12th. NPR's done a really good job of rolling out a lot of work from home tools. And while some people have at other businesses, I'm sure have worked from home a lot before this, most of us at NPR never did. I mean, I literally never worked from home before this. So they rolled out a lot of tools to us, including the ability to, use a conference bridge phone line and record that. And that turns out to be super convenient for me. It's something that it sort of took this crisis to have that, have the ability to use that. And now that I do, I'm not sure, I'll go back after this. I mean, I'll go back to the office, but I will continue to use that tool. So in some ways, like the reporting itself for me as someone who does a lot of reporting over the phone, that's not totally different. But I think what is hard is not being around my colleagues, I used to, for a few years, I was a freelance writer. And so it feels more like that. Because, here I am just kind of plugging away for 8 or 9 hours a day. And so I really do miss my colleagues. NPR is a pretty close-knit work environment where, your colleagues are also your friends in a lot of cases, and it just sort of helps break up the workday. And also, for me, I'm basically a general assignment reporter. So I report on all different kinds of things from, national news to international news to sports to what have you. And so for now, I've essentially become basically a coronavirus science reporter since this started. And so it's been a little bit crazy to, in some ways, have almost an entirely new job, like a whole new beat, but be doing that away from everyone else. If this was happening, but we were all still at the office, I could go and sit at a desk by the other science desk reporters and ask them questions of how they handle certain situations. But now all of that is happening over Slack and email and a sort of morning conference call with the other reporters on the science desk. So it's been a lot of learning as we go.
I'm sure having a whole new beat would be a dramatic change, especially as you said, you can't just chat by a veteran science reporter's desk in the newsroom. But have you found ways of getting around that obstacle? I've also been struck by just how quickly the angle on this outbreak changes from week to week, even day to day, from just how many aspects of society that this crisis affects.
Absolutely. I mean, it changes every few days. You become an expert on one thing and then the story moves along, So at the beginning it was, there was just such an emphasis on testing. And obviously there still is because there's still a shortage. But we were looking at which companies are coming out with tests and what's the difference between the United States tests and the German tests and why didn't we get those? And then, the last week or two, there's been so much talk about the World Health Organization and how is that funded? And so all of a sudden I'm becoming an expert on the funding of the World Health Organization. And now serological testing, like testing for antibodies and trying to get a handle on If antibodies aren't seen in the blood, what does that actually mean? And when will we know what it means? And trying to get a handle on not only how is the United States handling it, and every state is doing its own thing, but also what are other countries doing, and is it working in those places? And how much does weather, sort of temperature and things like that, or cultural factors come into play? And as a news organization, it's been really interesting because, distinct from anything I can remember, this is the first time that sort of everyone is now a coronavirus reporter. I mean, every beat, almost every story touches on the coronavirus in some way. And so it has required just a whole lot more coordination throughout the organization. Just lots of, here's what we're working on. What are you working on? Is anyone trying to do this? And of course, NPR, we have this, we have all these member stations across the country, which is great because we really can't leave home. I mean, a lot of our reporters, while they might be based in Washington, D.C. or somewhere, are generally, out on the road looking for people to interview. But now they're doing phone interviews too. And I think more than ever, we're really grateful to have all those NPR affiliates and all those NPR stations and all these different places around the country, because it has just set us up really well to cover the local at a time when movement is really limited.
Well, that's certainly good to hear that NPR was well positioned to cover the pandemic at both local and national levels, particularly at a time when we're seeing just an exponential expansion of news deserts in the U.S., starting with rural towns, it looks like. I'm curious to hear your thoughts about what the long-term effects of this will be in terms of public support and trust for local media, and whether this might bolster people's trust in their hometown newspaper or television and radio stations and otherwise.
It's a time that I think does show some of the strength of the public radio model. I think we've seen that play out for the last 5 or 10 years, actually, that there's been such contraction of the newspaper industry. And those newspapers are so important, and they're important all of the time, not just during this crisis. But they're important all of the time. But yet the money just isn't working, and people aren't subscribing. People are used to getting all their news on the internet for free, and then these big either like newspaper conglomerates or hedge funds buy up the newspapers and then shut them down or lay off all but a skeleton crew of reporters. And I mean, there's real consequences for that, obviously, and that a lot of national reporters read those local newspapers, on the internet. And that's how, the national reporters find out about what's going on and what stories do become national news. And so without those local reporters there to cover stuff and notice it, there's who knows what stories just won't be seen. And so I think that public radio has been, who knows what the next few months or years will bring, but it has been sort of a bright spot in the media landscape. And I think we've seen other news startups and other news organizations copying, frankly, the public radio model, where we, get sponsorship and support maybe from a local institution like a university, and then also ask the community for their support to value, to put a price on the value that they get out of our coverage and to support it. And, that has worked out really well and has sustained public radio stations around the country, which in turn sustain NPR. So, we are absolutely touched by all the economic fallout of the coronavirus, and it's hurting NPR's finances just as it's hurting so many news organizations' finances. But I do think that at times like this, certainly people may not be able to give. If they've lost their jobs, this is probably not the year they're going to donate to their public radio station necessarily. But I think people really are seeing the value in local news and national news that brings them, what's happening out in the world, especially when so many people are stuck at home.
It's been so disheartening to see many news companies, from small outlets to large networks, mandate furloughs and turn to salary cuts from this economic fallout we're experiencing. How have you seen NPR negotiate these financial challenges, and how has the organization changed its approach amidst a media landscape that is increasingly volatile?
This is a time that really values flexibility, and I've been impressed to see how NPR, my news organization, is able to change itself to this moment and to meet people with when and where they are listening and consuming news. So for NPR, that has meant that we started, like within the span of like a week, a new evening radio show. It's basically an extra hour of All Things Considered called The National Conversation, which is oriented around answering the public's questions about coronavirus. How does it spread, and how do I keep my family safe, to how do I get a haircut right now? And it's live every evening, every weeknight, with a panel of experts, including NPR reporters, but also including, doctors or public health officials. And it's been really cool to see NPR do that. And at the same time, I've seen how people who, because of certain things, maybe what they typically do isn't as needed or as possible right now. And, as they've kind of shifted into working a different job right now and doing that from home. It's been really good to see how a place that really, I think, believes in and, recognizes its need for its staff, like NPR, can move things around and reinvent certain things at a time like this, rather than laying off people, because it's just, obviously, it's going to keep us being able to put out, the strong reporting that people need right now, rather than rather than doing less than we were before in this time when people need so much information.
We'll be right back. Many members of the Morehead-Cain community are serving on the front lines of the pandemic. We have alumni working to combat food insecurity through meal deliveries, house healthcare professionals closer to their hospitals, support restaurant workers who have lost their jobs, increase access to research, and so much more. To learn how you can get involved, head to the COVID-19 response page on the Morehead-Cain network. We also have a special message from Executive Director Chuck Lovelace. Here's Chuck.
The spring semester is over here in Chapel Hill, and many scholar plans for the summer are still uncertain. If you are an alumnus or a friend and know someone who's having a hard time amidst this pandemic, please let us know so that we can reach out. Hope to see you again soon, and until then, be safe.
And now, back to the show. I was just listening to Chapel Hill's NPR member station, WUNC, on how they released their testing podcast, which looks at how North Carolina is dealing with COVID-19. And it's been cool to see the creative ways that news organizations are sharing information that will help people go about their daily lives. Now, we still know so little about this novel coronavirus that I have occasionally had to distance myself from all the news for a couple hours just for my own sanity. What's the conversation at NPR of how to get this important information to the public without freaking people out with constant death tolls and rising transmission rates and other stories related to morbidity?
So I don't work on a show, I don't work on Morning Edition or All Things Considered, but I do have a sense of how they work, and I've worked on them in the past. So, I think at NPR, as at, most serious news organizations, you can't change the fact that there's bad news. Obviously we can't, and we have a responsibility to report it, even or especially if it's terrible. And so this is one of those times. And so there's never, at least to my mind, I haven't heard any discussion. You can't downplay it. This is very serious, and you have to share that with people so that people do take it seriously and understand just, what a situation that we're in right now. At the same time, there's always steps taken to balance, the dark and worrying news with sort of, moments of joy. And that's been true well before the coronavirus. Before this, it's been years of sort of political turmoil in this country. And it's just been kind of one thing from one thing to the next. And so that's a balance that, we work on striking every day. And, if you are listening, I think you might notice that usually at the top of the hour, the first news stories, right, starting at, 8:06 a.m., tend to be the heaviest, right? That's like the day's big political news. And right now the biggest, coronavirus news and what the states are doing. And then as it gets to the end of the hour, the last few minutes, that's often, either whether it's the last 5 minutes or the last 20 minutes, depending on how much really serious stuff there is, that's when there can be moments of levity, so maybe it's an interview with a musician or an author who has a book coming out, or a way a local community is coming together. Those parts are in there not to distract from the seriousness of what's going on, but to recognize that we all need something to keep us going, something to keep us from getting, just in despair about all of this. So I think that's more the discussion. It's not necessarily that we can do anything to keep people from being freaked out. All we can do is try to, give them correct information as clearly communicated as clearly as possible, so that people are aware of the risks and the situation, but also give them things to keep hope alive and to feel connected to others in this time when so many people are isolated.
Well, Laurel, thank you so much. I appreciate your time. Is there anything else you'd like to add or share with scholars who are interested in going into journalism or related fields?
Sure. One thing I realized I forgot to mention, you mentioned that WUNC has a new podcast about coronavirus, and I just wanted to let folks know that NPR does as well. It's called the Coronavirus Daily, and it's basically the day's top stories about coronavirus, kind of all together in one space. So I think if you are maybe especially out of your typical news schedule, but want to make sure you're keeping up on everything, that can be a great way to do it. And then in terms of advice for scholars, I think that, I really feel terrible for them that the summer enrichment program is largely on hold this year. That really hit home for me to see that news, because I just know how big a part of the experience that is. And I know that, NPR had to cancel its internship program for this summer. And I just know that that's really tough on students who are trying to figure out where they want to go in life. But I just would say that, there are such interesting opportunities that arise right now, and so this is a good time to look for stories in your own community. If you're, at home and interesting things are happening in your town, this is a great chance to document that in some way. And you can always reach out to your local news organization while you're home, or a bigger one that you admire, and say, hey, this is going on here, and offer up a perspective, write an op-ed. I think people are just really curious about other people's experiences right now, knowing that there's so much variation. And so this is a good time to, sort of tap into the unique experiences that folks might be having, or what they are sad to be missing out on, or what their worries or fears or hopes are, and, to share that in some way and just sort of see where that goes. And yeah, thanks for talking with me.
Thank you for listening to Catalyze. I'm your host, Sarah O'Carroll, and that was Laurel Wamsley, a reporter for NPR. Lastly, over the weekend, Carolina virtually celebrated the class of 2020. So I'm going to end today's episode with a message for our graduating seniors from Robbie Bach, class of 84.
Cheers to the class of 2020. Even though you are graduating from Carolina under difficult circumstances, there are several things I hope you will remember. You have changed the UNC community and made it greater and better than when you discovered it. You have touched the lives of family, friends, faculty, Morehead-Cain team members, and so many others in a positive way. You have studied and grown, and probably a great deal more than you ever thought possible. You have created friendships and bonds that will endure, and in fact last a lifetime. And you will join the Tar Heel family forever. Congratulations on a great 4 years, and yes, I'm gone to Carolina in my mind.
That was from Robbie Bach in honor of our graduating seniors and in memory of Wynn Burris. That concludes today's show. Thank you to Jacob Hamilton, class of 2019, for recording this song for us. Until next time, Morehead-Cains, stay safe and stay well.